there's two options that we're looking at, and one is staying in, forming that new party, but we run the risk of a Kamala Harris and Waltz presidency because we draw votes from Trump, or we draw somehow more votes from Trump, or we walk away right now and join forces with Donald Trump, and you know, we walk away from that and we explain to our base why we're making this decision.
That's quite a candid admission on camera for someone running for president, isn't it? That was Nicole Shanahan, RFK Jr.'s running mate. Joining me now, Benjamin Weingarten, editor-at-large, Real Clear Investigations. Okay, Benjamin, that's quite a thing to say. What does it mean if these two drop out? They're, of course, scheduled to speak in Phoenix. Trump is scheduled to speak in Phoenix. What does this mean?
Well, if you assume that this election comes down to thousands of votes across a handful of states, and by all measures, that appears to be the trajectory of the thing, and you're talking about a candidate in RFK Jr. who's garnering multiple percentage points, particularly in the swing states, this could be a decisive move for the election. I'll caveat that, of course, setting aside all the machinations that the regime is going to engage in to ensure it gets the margin that it needs. This is a big deal. This also, by the way, I think illustrates a broader theme of this race, which is that it's the regime versus those who have been crushed by the regime. And RFK Jr., of course, has been smeared and maligned by the Democrats. His family has been targeted by the deep state. And at the end of the day, him throwing his weight behind Trump really could play a decisive role, again, when we're talking about such narrow margins.
Benjamin, how much weight is it? Because we haven't talked about him a lot on the show. Honestly, I haven't talked about the campaigns, any of them, a lot on the show. But are we talking about someone who's going to bring 5 percentage points? I don't understand how big his following is. Help me understand.
Yeah, we've seen, according to polling, certainly when he is on the ballot, it moves a pretty substantial percentage, anywhere from, say, 2 to 7%, thereabouts, depending on what state you're talking about. So, again, even going back to 2020 and 2016 was obviously down to thousands of votes in a few states. 2020, same thing. 4 or 5 states, tens of thousands of votes across those states. To the extent you have voters who are fed up with the machine and they're willing to go behind Trump and or not back, of course, Kamala Harris and the regime, that's meaningful and potentially decisive.
Benjamin, you have a piece up about Dome and how she still has zero policies out there, but you wrote a piece trying to understand the positions she has taken, and they're horrific. What are you talking about?
Well, I think that there are two questions that this election ought to ultimately hinge on if the merits mean anything. And one is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? But the other is Kamala Harris lying now about the positions that she has taken or that her flacks have taken? Or was she lying then? And by then, I mean 2020 and prior. If you look down the line at her positions on issues, longstanding positions, whether it comes to the anti-energy agenda, anti-fracking, whether it comes to universal health care, whether it comes to open borders and legalizing an invasion of this country, and on issue after issue, she is as radical as they come. And yet you see now her flacks trying to distance themselves from those positions with the caveats that they're going to go for a tax on unrealized gains, I guess, of 25% and a massive capital gains tax. And of course, stealing Trump policies like no tax on tips. The question that you have to ask yourself, the question that the American people have to ask themselves is this the candidate who ran in 2020, who is as radical as they come on all issues, the most liberal, I'd say, most progressive, radically leftist senator during her tenure there? Or is this the person now who's trying to triangulate and shift all of her positions? And there's no good answer. One answer is, yes, she takes essentially the maximalist communist position that she had in 2020. The other is she holds no views and you can't trust her at anything that she says. So I think that is the question that only Donald Trump really is going to be able to pose to her, because obviously the media, so-called media, but really the regime mouthpieces, have formed a protective bubble around her. She's not forced to speak. When the campaign speaks, it's through flax. Only Donald Trump will be able to put that question to her, and I don't think she's going to have a good answer for it before the American people.
Okay, so the contrast, I was thinking about this today, the contrast in the two campaigns is amazing. Trump's campaign couldn't possibly be more open. Some would argue, I would probably argue, probably too open. He's sitting down with every Tom, Dick, and Harry podcaster, ABC News, enemy. It doesn't matter who it is, Trump will sit down and talk, which I really admire. I don't know that I agree with the campaign strategy, but I admire it. She is hiding under a desk, as you just pointed out. The only time you even hear her positions, it's from some dork they roll out on MSNBC. So who understands the electorate better?
Fair question. I think what it reflects on the Trump side is, first of all, this is who he is. I mean, he gave access, to your point, maybe to a fault, to his worst enemies when he was the president of the United States. And of course, they tried to shiv him at every turn they got. And he may work under the assumption all press is good press. The media really is the enemy of the people. So going and jousting with them, maybe that ultimately pays off. What Kamala understands, what the regime understands, and what we've seen in terms of how they maneuvered, and that's a polite way of putting it, Joe Biden out of the way, is that it really doesn't matter who the front man is for the regime. They ran the basement campaign in 2020. They're running a new updated version of a basement campaign in 2024, where the candidate doesn't have to speak, the candidate doesn't have to take questions. They assume all Democrat voters are in the bag. And if they can just propagandize to the nth degree, they can move enough normie voters or Trump haters who otherwise really disagree with the Democrat agenda and get them to go along. So I think both of them understand the electorate. The Trump position has to be the more aggressive position, I think, by default, because you have the entire government, the academy, media, all across the board. All of our cultural institutions are all in line behind the regime. I don't even say Kamala Harris, behind the regime. So it makes sense for her to play prevent defense. Prevent defense fails in sports a lot, but when you're playing sports, you don't have the refs on your team and everyone else on your team. So that's the challenge to Donald Trump, is how do you break through a protective bubble and essentially an information space that is at total war with you.
You brought up Democrats cheating in the various ways they do in elections. You've done extensive reporting on illegals, non-citizens voting in our elections. Elaborate on this for those of us who haven't done that kind of digging.
Yeah, so there have been tens of thousands of non-citizens cropping up on voter rolls really over the last 2 decades, and at least hundreds of instances of those individuals that we know of that have been caught found to be voting in past elections. There is no documentary proof of citizenship necessary to register as a voter in America, which is a remarkable thing in and of itself. And then when you look at the additional state requirements, for example, for voting in person or absentee, very few states require any sort of ID that would require you to prove that you're a citizen to actually be able to participate in elections. Now combine that with the biggest invasion we've ever had in the history of the country. And obviously it raises questions about, are we going to have illegal aliens showing up on voter rolls en masse? And are they going to vote in meaningful enough numbers to swing a very tight election? And then you combine this, of course, with the fact that Democrats, progressive groups have protected this whole notion of third-party voter registration and mobilization, which of course could be really meaningful in states that allow ballot harvesting, even before you get to illegal acts. You put it all together, and potentially you have the elections in a position to be swung, if not this race, then maybe down the road, by potential illegal alien votes, while Democrats are trying to allow non-citizens to vote increasingly in jurisdictions across the country. So I went out and basically asked of the secretaries of state or the election boards in all the swing states, what are you doing to ensure that non-citizens aren't getting on the rolls and that they're not going to vote on election day? And I've got to say, the response was pretty dumbfounding. Essentially, they said, there's not a lot of evidence in the past. It's illegal to do it, as if illegality is going to be a bar to someone whose first act in this country is breaking our law. And or there might be innocent victims, of course, of the progressive groups going out there aggressively trying to register and mobilize everyone they can. And a lot of people get signed up to vote when they're simply getting a driver's license. And you can get a driver's license as a non-citizen in almost 24 states, and actually as a non-citizen in every state, but as an illegal alien in almost 24 states. You put all this together, there's no coherent, systematic effort to cross the voter rolls with citizenship data, which is already incomplete to begin with when you have millions of quote unquote undocumented in this country. And it presents a potential mess, or a very, very minimum auto-erode our confidence in the integrity of the election system. And so I reported about this for Real Court Investigations. The House has put out legislation that passed in the House that would require documentary proof of citizenship. Democrats are stalling it in the Senate. We'll see if this is a fight in the upcoming budget battles in September. But from a practical perspective, you're not even really going to be able to implement this prior to Election Day 2024. So when we look back at how tight this race is and the chicanery that goes on, you got to look at non-citizen voting as a potential issue here. And almost everything is passive here. It's all if a third party group, a lawyer, a party brings a challenge against certain votes. But how are you even going to find the population of votes that may be non-citizen votes in the first place? There's no voter roll aggressive maintenance, so-called, when it comes to non-citizenry across this country. And that poses, I think, an existential threat ultimately to our elections.
I would thank you for coming to my YouTube channel, but I know how brilliant it is, and I know you love it here. So subscribe and watch. We're going to start really ramping things up and putting some funny stuff, some interesting stuff out there, some collaborations. Either way, my YouTube channel is officially the place to be. So stick around.